Hi, welcome to Making Sense of Complexity, featuring conversations with complexity science practitioners and philosophers. Our goal is to share insights on how to make sense of our complex and uncertain world. Today our guest is Gary F. Bengier, a writer, philosopher, and technologist, the author of the award-winning sci-fi novel Unfettered Journey, and a board member with the Santa Fe Institute. Let's begin. Hi, Gary. Welcome.
Well, hello, George. I'm delighted to be here with you today.
Yeah, it's nice to have you. I'm really delighted, very excited. And I like to ask all my guests where you're calling in from and what the weather's like.
So I'm here in San Francisco today. I've just gotten back from a weekend in Santa Fe where I was at the Santa Fe Institute. I'm on the board there, and their weather was cold and lots of fire danger. So I'm delighted to see that we don't yet have that here in Northern California.
Yeah, it usually comes on a little bit later in the summer, doesn't it? I mean,
I'm afraid so, yes,
yeah,
yes.
yeah. It's yeah. I have a nephew that lives in Santa Rosa, and he's been right in the heart of some of those big fires. So, yeah, and that's it's kind of a common theme of the way the climate is changing over time. I happen to be in Concord, Massachusetts right now, and it's kind of a drizzly day out, so not unusual for the spring. And we thankfully don't have a lot of big fire danger here, and the hurricanes usually avoid us. So that's it feels safe to be in this location. So I'm really excited about talking to you because your book that I think it came out just over a year ago, I guess it was.
That's right, about a year and a half ago now.
Yeah,
Yes.
Unfettered Journey. And I just found it to be a really fun, compelling narrative, great love story, speculative fiction of a good type. But then woven in that was some lightly done, but some serious philosophical concepts that are woven in there. So I just wanted to ask you about that. What was that journey like to put that together?
Well, I'm glad we'll start with the book, but I think we should move on because I think, George, we won't be talking about the book. So to summarize that, I actually have two books. I have a book called Unfettered Journey Appendices, which is a rigorous, very thin volume with basically three papers on it. Philosophical explorations on time, ontology, and the nature of mind. So those three topics are covered. So I think we'll be talking a lot about that. My writing of the novel was to produce a work that would be an less rigorous and easier entree to some of those topics. So it starts from the philosophy. And as you said, my book Unfettered Journey is a novel. It's a literary cross-genre adventure and love story that takes place in the future, and it explores a lot of philosophical issues as well as questions of what society will be like and social justice in the future, and I think it's a good read. I've got lots of good feedback from
Yeah.
it. It's now in 7 languages, and my Russian edition will be coming out this week, so I'll be in 8 languages, and the book has won 7 awards to date. So
Yeah.
very pleased with the introduction of that. But today we'll be talking about, I think, more of the philosophy. So I'm delighted to talk to you about that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to ask one question about the book. It almost feels like you have a compelling story about the philosophy that you want to communicate, and dealing with the world, and this was a vehicle for you to accomplish that goal, as opposed to writing a book because you want to make a lot of money or get a lot of readers.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's absolutely no financial reward in writing a book these days, I think, for anybody.
Yeah.
And that's not the objective. Yeah, the actual objective was to get the philosophy out to a larger audience. And it's most of academics, it's a fairly narrow area with a very small readership, and so but I think these are important ideas, and I've been thinking about some of these ideas for over 30 years. So some ask me about the writing process, and I've got sort of one book. That's it, because I think I've got one, I think, important idea. So.
Yeah. So your journey, as you said, you've been thinking about these ideas for 30 years, but you got started in the business world and tech world before that, and so how have you kind of made that journey from business and tech into complexity and philosophy, and so what was that journey like? Your
Well,
journey?
yeah. Well, quite honestly, if I look back at my undergraduate days when I arrived at university, I actually had some regrets. Some of my colleagues in the honors college, they were pursuing philosophy degrees, and it was it was sad to me that I realized I couldn't switch and do that, or mathematics, which I also really loved. But I just didn't have the money to be able to do anything except a more practical kind of path. And so I got degrees in computer science and decision theory, and then had more of a business career. So for order of over 30 years, I was pursuing a successful career, and I love technology. So I learned a lot and enjoyed a lot of going deep into technology as part of that. But
Hmm.
I always had this desire to get back to some of those fundamental questions that had always intrigued me. Why are we here?
Hmm.
Do we have free will? I mean, those
Hmm.
questions just have been with me throughout. So, as I'm pursuing this career, for example, I would read Kierkegaard. I tried by myself to understand Kant, right?
Hmm.
Without a guide, it's very difficult to do this. And so,
Yeah, it's very, very difficult.
uh,
Yeah.
so,
So, and
so
I'm also interested. You landed at the Santa Fe Institute on the board there, and what excites you about what's happening there?
Well, I was at eBay, and eBay is a complex network. And in around 1999, 2000, Pierre Omidyar and I, the founder, and I went down to Santa Fe, and we both became intrigued. He joined the board, and then I shortly did afterwards in about 2003 or so. So I've been on the board of the Santa Fe Institute for quite a number of years. And the mathematics of complexity has intrigued me. I think James Glick wrote his book Chaos in the late 80s, and I remember getting that and just being taken by the nonlinearity of the world that the mathematics described.
Hmm.
And I think being associated with Santa Fe Institute for so many years, it gives you a paradigm about thinking about the world um, that there's a deep feeling, I think, that's shared among the people who've been engaged there, that the world itself is organized in a very complex way, and we find complex systems defining everything. So it's a different
Hmm.
way of looking at the world, and I think it's an important paradigm. So.
Yeah, and that's a good way to start because I wanted to start with kind of one of the roots of complexity science. It covers a lot of territory, a lot of
Mhm.
disparate fields, but one of the roots is in the study of dynamic systems.
Mhm.
And one of the observations that some people have made about kind of the roots of science, through the years from the Greeks and then through the scientific and Enlightenment, the Revolution, and on into the modern age, is the sense that scientists are generally looking at you know little things in boxes or closed what you might call closed systems, experimental, setting up experiments, looking at things in that inside of that box, and that ends up casting the world in these sort of little frames, and that's sort of consistent with thinking about things as inside of a box or a closed system, if
Mhm.
you will, an experimental system or closed system. But complex systems are not closed. They're
Mhm.
dynamic. Everything has a flow of either energy or matter or things going. So that's a very different kind of thing to be looking at than the old-fashioned closed systems. I
Okay,
wonder if you
yeah.
just talk about that for a second.
Yeah, so let's just let's take a simple example. Imagine a pendulum swinging back and forth, okay? And then you can imagine you can try to close that system off if you were a scientist. Put it in a vacuum, use the greatest kind of oil on the one joint so that has as little friction as possible, and you swing it back and forth. We can imagine what that does. Okay, now imagine another step with a double pendulum with two joints in it, okay? And
Mm-hmm.
you can look that up if you can't imagine that for our listeners. But that immediately adds an enormous amount of nonlinearity into that very simple system. So it's got rich dynamic behavior, and it's highly sensitive to initial conditions. So, for example, if you imagine that you were to take that double jointed pendulum and hold it up on top in a straight line, and then release it, what would happen? Well, the result of letting go is incredibly dynamic. The equations are some ordinary differential equations, but it's very hard to predict what it will do next. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's just with one extra joint
Right.
in the system.
Right.
And in fact, at the margin, imagine you could balance it perfectly and it sat there. Now we can imagine doing that, but it turns out that actually you're now, if you divide space and time down to the
Mm-hmm.
Planck distance, the most ridiculously tiny distance that we can imagine. At that point, it's kind of hard to say, did you unbalance it slightly to the left or to the right? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and so
Mm-hmm.
the even at that most granular level that science tells us we could get to, one thing or another will happen. It's not, in that regard, it's hard to describe that as deterministic entirely.
Mm-hmm.
Because at the Planck distance,
Mm-hmm.
that's when the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle comes into play, and that suggests that you cannot know the position um, or the moment at the same time, right?
Right.
You can only know one, and in fact, the other is it's not even unknowable; it's undefined. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so
Undeterminable, cannot
uh,
be determined. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. So what's interesting is that pendulum is a relatively simple system that you described, the two-arm pendulum. And it's, I think, similar in concept to what's called the three-body problem. If you're
yes,
trying to define the gravitational movement or the movement among three forces attracted by gravity, three instead of two. Two is pretty simple, but when three, the equations get really, really, really difficult. But that is still, in some sense, a kind of a defined, closed problem. And that kind of behavior, isn't that what's called chaotic behavior? That's
yes,
the
and and
chaos theory, saying,
yes.
minor changes in initial conditions. And yeah, you point out that you could balance it, but then you're dealing with things of quantum fluctuations is essentially going to push it one way or the other, and completely unpredictable.
And once you get over 3 degrees of freedom into a system, it is completely nonlinear. We don't have the mathematics to sort that out. And yet, think about it. Most of the world has far more than 3 degrees of
Hmm.
freedom.
Hmm.
You
Yeah,
sitting in that chair has so many more degrees of freedom. So
yeah,
all of us are immersed just it's hard to
yeah,
imagine how many different degrees of freedom apply to macro objects
yeah.
in the universe.
And so, yeah, there has been this kind of picture of the mechanical world, Newtonian worldview of everything, mechanical and time and space, all predictable. And I still hear physicists, talking about, the Laplace's demon. Well, if you knew the position of every particle and
Hmm.
you knew the laws of physics, you would know all of the future. And so why that image of the clockwork world just seems to be so compelling that people hold on to it in spite of what we know about this three body problem of the
So
pendulum.
yeah, so So science has been very successful at a reductionist approach, right? You break it down, and in fact, on the smallest level at particle physics, the standard model that we have now does an incredible job at being able to predict the next thing about items at that level. But I'll point to Philip W. Anderson. He actually passed away at the very beginning of the pandemic, not from the pandemic, but he was associated with the Santa Fe Institute, Nobel laureate, and he was actually instrumental in some of the early discussions that established the Santa Fe Institute. He's famous, among other things, for this one paper called "More is Different."
Hmm.
And he uses an example of he was a chemist, and the ammonia molecule, and describing that even if you take all of the physics and that lead to the chemistry to how we believe that molecules work, that one cannot use that reductionist approach to explain what happens to the ammonia molecule. It doesn't follow any rules that could be deducible from the reductionist view. And because so that actually I mentioned Philip Anderson because he's the probably the originator of a lot of conversation about emergence.
Hmm.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that's where it
Thank
comes
you
from.
for going there. That's where I want to go. Yeah.
So and his comment that more is different is that the reductionist view does not answer the question of how things are organized. So
Hmm.
I think there's a question about determinism, is that one need not question determinism at the most granular level itself, but the question is, does that determinism then dictate that at a macroscopic level that things are still deterministic?
Hmm.
And I think that complexity mathematics and some other things suggest that it isn't, that things emerge um, from the patterns among things at some other level of organization.
Right. Yeah. And I wanted to ask about that again. I go back to my simple notion of a dynamic system, like
Hmm.
there's factors coming in from the outside or energy from the outside. So there's this turbulent behavior because there's change happening. And yet somehow within that turbulent, chaotic experience, sometimes stable structures begin to emerge in that dynamic system. So it begins to look like, something consistent, a structure. The example I use is turbulence in the flow of water. And, if water is going down a drain, it can become a verticular flow, sort of a very stable structure that does, certain good things in the system. But it emerges, and it's not like, somebody's telling it what to do. It just sort of emerges from that process. So
Yeah.
that's what
Well,
you're.
and another example is surface tension on a drop of water, right?
Yeah.
Where does that come from? That surface tension? Well,
Hmm.
again, some of these properties, I'll use that word loosely, and we'll come back to that, I hope,
Yeah.
are used to describe things, but they don't come from the underlying reductionist view. So.
Right, right. And just to take another step up the ladder of, from physics to chemistry to biology, my first guest was Daniel Friedman, who's an expert on ants and ant behaviors. And, there's an example where the individual ants don't have much in terms of their capacity to evaluate or judge or make choices. They're very, very simple in terms of the patterns. But and if you take one out of the nest, it'll die. It won't have any role to play, and it will die. But when you get a million of them together, certain behaviors and patterns begin to arise that create a colony. And at the level of a colony, there's a kind of intelligence about how things are organized. That's what they call self-organization. So this process seems to emerge not from the individual components, but somehow from this larger behavior of the whole. And that's an example people point to of emergent characteristics. And what I think what you were saying that kind of Anderson was looking at the math of it, and the math is saying that you can't look at the individual ants, even at the millions of individual ants, and figure out what's going to happen.
Yes,
Right?
well,
You can't predict it.
And I'm a beekeeper among other things, and so I see that with my bees in my apiary. And yeah, and in fact, there's a paper I just saw from a few weeks ago that they think that I think bees can tell odd versus even. So there's some behaviors that, and where does that come out of from that very simple creature, right? So
Yeah.
yeah. And so we've said a couple of things. We've talked about those behaviors that grow out of simple systems, and it seems there's something deeply mathematical about that. There's something deeply mathematical about the world, and then as we bring more of these pieces together into networks, those networks themselves sort of generate, or from them emerge these much more complicated behaviors.
Yeah. Yeah. So that emergence, so how does that concept of emergent phenomenon square with kind of the older fashioned idea of cause and effect that, scientists were good at looking at inside their little experimental constructs to determine cause and effect. And you think about it, in Newtonian sense of billiard balls hitting billiard balls, and so there's a direct cause and effect. But how do you explain emergence with that concept, or it's just a different concept?
Yeah, well, it seems like if you're just trying to deal with a reductionist view, you're missing an enormous amount of what's really going on in the world. Let me use one more example. This is from Jeffrey West at the Santa Fe Institute. He wrote a book a couple years ago called Scale, which became a minor bestseller.
Yeah, and it's right up there, by the way.
Okay, yeah.
So right up there.
So he, for example, found these scaling laws that apply across an enormous number of different kinds of things. So, for example, there's a scaling law in biology that tracks between the smallest mammal, a vole, up to a blue whale, and it turns out that those structures are driven by a 3/4 power rule. Law. So there's a deep mathematics in that structure about how large they are, how long they live, how many heartbeats they have, and those kinds of structures. And then Jeff even traces those same structures across the development of cities, against companies, and huge social structures. So.
Right. If I recall it, the scaling law, the numbers of 3/4, I guess it is, actually come out of the mathematics of the way circulatory systems can efficiently manage the flow of blood in the case of the body, or information in terms of cities. So there's a mathematical explanation for those laws. Now, do you consider that to be causal?
Well, to add one thing, it comes out of the fact that we live in a 4-dimensional universe, right? That we experience 3 dimensions of space, and the 3 dimensions of space dictate that. And it turns out then that the mathematics regarding biological creatures follows that rule. So again, that suggests something deeply mathematical about the way the structure of the universe works, and that within that 4-dimensional space, there's this sort of emerges these incredibly complex systems, right? That again suggests that they're not deterministic. Back to your Laplace's demon, it seems to be overthrown by what we see in the real world.
Yeah. But it still feels to a certain extent that, like you're saying, that the mathematics are causal. In other words, we can explore these systems. We look at the scaling laws. We look at the 3-dimensionality of space, and some of these characteristics will fall out of that
Okay,
mathematical
I'm
analysis.
delighted that you're turning to cause and causation because that's one of the ideas at the heart of my philosophical journey. But let me put a point on the where we've gotten to so far. I think is that you can tell that I'm deeply scientific. I'm following a very scientific approach. I think that um, the laws of science have taught us a lot of things so far. Our empirical research with countless experiments, and it seems that the universe itself is a closed system. Okay, that
Well,
it follows.
we might want to talk about that, but yeah, let's
Okay,
accept
okay,
the premise that the universe is a closed system. So there are
mhm,
no causal influences of any type outside of that system. That's
that are
that
reaching in.
the
So
starting point. Yeah.
that's a starting point for me because all of the science has seemed to indicate that that's true. We have conservation laws and that sort of thing that seem to be true at every time that we try to test for them. So, and that it's an interestingly mathematical system, and and which is also very intriguing. So before I go to causation, as science has proceeded, um, you think about Newton with his equations, and we realize those equations showed something deeply true about the universe. So if you go to the
Hmm.
math and you find some elegant equations, and then you do the tests, frequently they point to the way the world is organized. The physicist Wigner wrote a short paper that was very influential, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences. And he just pointed out that this is sort of unexplainable. Why is it that the math tends to explain things about the natural world so well? Um, and scientists accept that. They accept that they find something that's deeply elegant. It tends to explain something about the universe. So why is that? That certainly seems to suggest that the universe is organized around some kind of mathematical principles that actually are deeply elegant. So follow the elegant math, and you most likely will find something about the universe that's true. Okay, that's sort of an odd thing, but that seems to be true. And in fact, some would argue that for the last 40 years of string theory, that's what's been happening in theoretical physics, because the math is so beautiful that the string theorists have been trying to prove that that's the way the universe is. Well, they haven't been very successful,
Right. Right.
but that's where it's going. So that's something to hold on to. So okay, within that question now, do you want to go back to causation?
Yeah. Yeah. That's where we started. So let's go back there.
Okay, so I'll start at something even. Let me make a step first about something even more fundamental, I think. Um, so the quick digression to epistemology and what we can really know. Okay, um, David Hume had his famous fork, his tremendously important philosophical observation, um, and the thinking goes something like this. He divided in his fork the what we can know, our epistemology, what we can know, into two groups. The mathematical things. You can prove something mathematically, and you can know it's true. You can just
Hmm.
know it's true. You can show the proof. Okay,
Hmm.
and
And
then
each
think
a proof is a tautology. It's just
it's
by
a tautology.
definition, if you follow the proofs, it's a tautology, and therefore it must be true logically.
It must be
Yeah.
true
Yeah.
logically. So there's
Math works
something
that way. That's
there's
great.
there's a logic underneath everything
Yeah.
that dictates everything that we know, and if you can prove it mathematically, it is true. So you can know that
Yeah.
with certainty. The rest of the other bucket is things of the world, basically,
Mhm.
and that's includes everything that can be known by science. And his point was that one cannot know anything there with such certainty. So if you were to take your your phone and hold it up and drop it, then uh, we all know that it will fall, right? uh, but Hume asked the question, how do we know that? Why won't that phone, go up or sideways
Mm-hmm.
or some other
Mm-hmm.
direction? And his point is, well, and most people will say, of course it's going to fall. Well, we kind of know that because of this thing called gravity. But Hume's point is there is no logical necessity in that being true. Okay?
Right.
So, we are embedded in the four-dimensional world or more dimensions. We experience the world, and and through a constant conjunction of the same thing happening over and over again, every time you drop something, it falls, unless you're in space.
Mm-hmm.
So we're used to that, and we make that assumption. But there's no logical necessity. That's Hume's conclusion. So what causes anything? How do we know what causes what? So I'm starting with the point that there's no logical necessity to say anything about causation with absolute certainty. All we can do is use our empirical experience to make better and better scientific um, conclusions. Okay?
Right. And when we have one of those, we might as well behave as if it
Yes,
were a law of nature,
that's right.
a given, a postulate, a fact, even though there's a risk that it could be wrong, and one event is enough to disprove, one counterfactual is enough to disprove a given law of nature, but, we proceed as if, but we really can't know for sure. Is that kind of what the
That's right.
Humean perspective is? Yeah,
And
yeah,
then you move forward in the philosophy of science, and you have Kuhn with his paradigm shifts, and so we believe those things because of this accumulation of evidence until such time as some dramatic new evidence shakes our paradigm of how the world is organized. And the classic example is our Newtonian physics overturned by relativity, right?
hmm
We have suddenly a different change. Now, that's well, it's enormous paradigm shift, but it's also that Newtonian physics can be subsumed within relativity theory, and all of those rules
right.
more or less work within our experience, measure
Yeah, and
experience.
there's an argument that the Newtonian worldview is relatively consistent with our everyday experience of time and space, and therefore it's a helpful mental map that addresses most of the questions we might have. But as science has explored the frontiers, the towards the beginning of the Big Bang, or towards the smallest, bits of space and time, it no longer works.
Yes,
So we no longer have that psychological comfort that our experiential view of the world and this scientific view of the world called Newtonian physics, is a map. Now it's not, our intuitive sense of how things work is not mapping to
right.
what quantum physics and complexity science and other things are driving at.
Right. So now let me just take a quick bit of history. So Democritus, came up with the word atom, and we thought of the
Mm-hmm.
world as a bunch of little atoms, particles in some sense. Fast forward to James Young in the 1700s. He actually came up with the double slit experiment.
Mm-hmm.
One of the Renaissance minds, I think there was a book that talks about Young as the last Renaissance man, and that changed the paradigm. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me back up. Newton believed in corpuscles, also an
Mm-hmm.
atomistic view of the universe, and so Newton's 17th century view was again atomistic.
Yep.
Young then, with his experiment, proved that it was waves. Okay,
Yep.
think it's as opposed to these individual particles, it's a continuous kind of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then along came Einstein, and then quantum physics, and again it's quantized. It's back to particles again. So within that, you
But
know,
not particles in the same. It's a very different kind of corpuscular nature, not the hard little balls that atoms were visualized, but
right,
as a
right.
some some kind of entity or object that's at blank space and blank time. And you can define some things about that, but you know there is no deeper.
Well, and
There's
yes,
there
and even more
yeah.
than that, when I go from Einstein and the early quantized view, again back to particles, from waves, from Young's waves to particles, and then with quantum mechanics, and we have now the duality. You know, is it a wave or is it a particle? And in fact, the answer is kind of both. And quantum mechanics, we can't really make sense of that because our intuitions about it has to be either a wave or a particle are violated. A more recent book by Carlo Rovelli, actually it was about a year ago, called Helgoland, and it is his attempt to really go back to quantum mechanics and try to understand it. And there's something called the Copenhagen explanation that came from the beginning of the last century, which was sort of the way that they kind of try to square the circle between these two things. And Carlo Rovelli says, well, it doesn't quite work. It's still not logical, and that he thinks that there's something relational fundamentally at the basis of the universe.
Yeah,
So.
I thought you were going to get there. Yes, I thought you were going to get there.
Yes.
I've done my homework.
Okay.
Before we do though, I just wanted to go back and quiz again this issue of you know the intuition we have about space and time is consistent with Newtonian physics, but now at odds with what we're finding from relativity and quantum theory. So that's tough to make sense of,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And then also this, this corpuscular view we have, and now we're finding that they could be waves or particles or both or both and you know that sense of the ontology is not consistent with the way we normally intuit things in the world, and so that's also pretty difficult to make sense of. So no, expressing the fact that we are a bit at sea in terms of making sense of these things is right. I mean, we have this difficulty of our intuitive world and the world that science is exploring, and one of those, I'll just go back to this emergence phenomenon that somehow these scaling laws appear when you look at large numbers in network configurations, and they appear and they're coming out of the mathematics, but that is very difficult to sort of wrap your intuition around, that this kind of abstraction of mathematics is somehow causal to what we're seeing in the world. So all of that, it's difficult to make sense of that. So let's just put that on hold, because I think where you're going with the relational question is maybe a way of making some sense of this. It's a different way of thinking about things. So let's go down that. I think thinking about if we think about networks of things, it's a little easier to sort of think about them as relational. Like when you think about Newtonian gravity, you're thinking about objects and cause and effect between objects, but you can also look at gravity as something that's really relational between masses, and everything has a relationship to everything else. That's what gravitational attraction says. So it's more of a set of relationships than necessarily it is a different way of visualizing than thinking about just particles and forces.
Yeah. So just to put a point on this, our four-dimensional universe that we believe that we're embedded in. That's what all the standard model tells us. There's four dimensions at least, and we tend to look at the world through what we can experience. Okay, but I told you the epistemology, what we can know, it does not make
Mm-hmm.
that absolutely true.
Mm-hmm.
We have to do more experiments. And then how does this stuff emerge? The sort of the traditional way of thinking about it is in terms of properties. Okay, if you go back to the philosophy, there's an ontology is the philosophy, the subfield of what there is, and we tend to think in basic elements in ontology that make up what there is of things like objects and properties, and then maybe relations. And that word properties is used all the time by everyone. We think about a property of something. And so in my papers there, I really ask the question, what is a property? Is there really a property? And where is it? Okay. So and I reached the conclusion that I do not see any evidence for properties themselves. Okay, that's a key point because um, where are they in our experience? As you drill down through levels of scale, from our macro scale down to molecules, to smaller than molecules, what we typically think of as properties disappear. So, typical properties are things like seeing, light, color. And color disappears at a certain level when you get down to smaller and smaller levels. And it's just not there. It's not in anything that we see. So,
Can I make an analogy there? Because again, I'll go back to the ant and the colonies. You'll see behaviors at the level of the colony, and then if you try to break it down and you look at the ants, you don't see it anymore.
right,
So that's kind of that same process. When you go down and you look at those properties, the properties of the ant colony, and now you look at the ants, and you don't. It's not there. You can't see it because it's
exactly.
really only exists at the level of a colony.
Yeah. So, so,
Yeah.
so where are those properties, right? uh, or those things that we imagine as properties? Where is that at? Um, so I said earlier that I believe in what the science tells us about it being a closed physical universe. The current theories are that it's at least 5 dimensions, and maybe 10 or 11 according to some of the string theorists. The math since Kaluza in 1915 demonstrated 5 dimensionality. Okay, uh, a footnote on that: Kaluza was a mathematician, and he was joined by Klein, a physicist, to try to explain mathematically some of Einstein's equations. And Kaluza discovered that in 5 dimensions, mystically, the Maxwell equations and Einstein's relativity came together in what's called the Kaluza miracle. The math was just so incredibly elegant in 5 dimensions. Again, that scientists believed it must be true. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and so 5 dimensions, Kaluza-Klein spaces became the basis for physics in theoretical physics from that time forward. And then only in about the 70s or 80s, then suddenly some other theoretical physicists says, wait a minute, here's some even more elegant mathematics if we add more dimensions. But so the world is not 4 dimensions that we experience, space-time, but the science suggests it's at least 5. So there are other dimensions that the science suggests exist that we do not have access to. Okay, could those, what we think of as properties, those relations, George, that you described, could they exist there? And then could those be causal? Okay, to close this whole loop, could those be causal? And could they exist there? And that's the heart of my hypothesis. And I think that hypothesis perhaps offers some fascinating answers to many of these problems that have seemed to be intractable for so long.
It's a little hard to visualize, to use a three-dimensional analogy, um, what what kinds of properties you're referring to there that would sort of find their mode of causality in dimensions that we don't see or experience on a regular basis. And I don't know if you'll be able to explain it any better, but one of the puzzles of quantum physics that I'm aware of is the paired particles. You know, in a quantum event, two paired particles with identical spin, for example, but it's not determined, but you know they had the same spin. They head off in different directions in the universe, and when one of those particles actually gets measured and the spin is determined, the other one automatically, whenever measured, would show that same spin, even if they're light years apart. And so that appears to either be subject to hidden variables, which nobody's ever seen, or
Mhm.
communication faster than the speed of light, which nobody believes, or something else that nobody can explain. So,
Yeah,
is this potentially a relational factor that is in a dimension that somehow is outside of the frame of our normal four-dimensional
yeah. Okay, so,
worldview?
so let me pick one of those examples that is on the cutting edge that seems to be unexplainable, and that is some of the results of Bell's theorem, which suggest non-locality. And what does that mean? We imagine that there are particles in the universe, and
Hmm.
and we have this billiard ball thought about how it works. One bumps into another, and there's a direct cause of one object, one particle on another. Okay. And we still have that left over from the old Newtonian view of the world. Non-locality seems to be borne out by multiple experiments over the last 20 years to show um, that in fact that doesn't describe the world. That things that are not in any way like particles are reacting with each other in four-dimensional space is true. It's just doesn't explain it. And they continue to run experiments on Bell's theorem to close off all of these loopholes that could be other experiments. And in each of the experiments so far continues to point to non-locality as a true description of our universe. So that brings into question our still extant view of sort of particles in some sense reacting in this four-dimensional space. Okay, so um, and that again gets to the basis of these questions of this conundrum in quantum mechanics and relativity, and we can't seem to make sense out of it. It's similar to the split experiment. Is it a wave? Is it a particle? We can't make sense of those either. So again, imagine that we're embedded in this four-dimensional space, but what if it's 5 dimensions or more? And we don't have any access in terms of our sensory experience to those extra dimensions. What if in those other dimensions, or one of them at least, there is cause that causes everything in our four-dimensional space, and that cause is in fact relational. So the way to imagine it is to think of, let me use the block of time and then move from that. In terms of thinking about time, one way to think about time, four dimensions, the fourth dimension, is to think about it as a brick, as a block.
The
Where
Minkowski loaf.
yes,
Yes, the Minkowski loaf.
so where
Yep.
a two-dimensional slice is our three-dimensional space. So imagine you take
Hmm.
our three-dimension space and think of it as a slice, as a two-dimensional, and then time. as the fourth dimension. Imagine that as the third dimension in our block. So you can imagine moving through time as going through slices of time, okay? Slices of space piled up one after another, okay? So now we have a block view of the universe.
Hmm.
And now we can start to imagine that because we can imagine in 3 dimensions, okay? That's a view of space-time that we can get. And by the way, relativity theory says that all 4 dimensions exist. So the entire block of space-time exists. It's all sort of there, if you will. If you could be outside of space and time, you could see it from a sort of a cosmological view, okay? Um, okay, let's go to the next level. This is difficult. But now let's take these 4 dimensions of space-time and imagine they are like a surface. Let's think of them as again, as a plane, as a 2-dimensional surface. And we might even better imagine that. Imagine it's a finite surface, so it's a closed sphere, for example. Okay, so our 4-dimensional space-time is this closed sphere. Now you can imagine that inside and outside of that sphere are other dimensions. Okay. And I already mentioned that the Calusa mathematics suggests that 5 dimensions is incredibly elegant. It's sort of at least 5 dimensions, okay? So now imagine that outside of that sphere is another dimension, and that is causal on this 4-dimensional space-time that we exist in. And that's where this relational causation is resident in a closed universe.
So the two paired particles have a relational feature that's held together or pulled together or somehow touching in that extra dimension. So that's
exactly
a possible way of explaining it. Doesn't, as a way of avoiding, violations of relativity and
exactly.
And
so here's another analogy thing. Imagine that the universe is like a internal combustion engine, okay, where the electrical system is outside of our 4 dimensions, okay?
Yeah.
So if engineers, scientists were studying this and they suddenly see this spark appearing at some point, and then the engine moves and things happen, but we can't tell what causes that spark, where that entire electrical system is hidden from us, right? Well, we still could describe exactly how that engine worked. A spark appeared out of who knows where, and things happened, and it worked, okay? And so we would have a perfectly understandable explanation of how that internal engine worked, except where the spark came from and how that all worked. That would be hidden from us. Now, so imagine now that this entire causal apparatus is somehow hidden from us, and all we see in our 4-dimensional experience of the universe is these results, but they also perfectly make sense most of the time, right? There tend to be mathematical causal rules, deterministic causes that we can model mathematically for most of the stuff, except for this complexity which is driven by these nonlinear systems. So.
All right, we're getting close to our timeline here, and I just wanted to stretch that a bit because for a 4-dimensional creature, this multi-dimensional thing sounds a little bit like magic, and now we've identified something that could be causally related in that other difficult thing. We can't imagine it because we're inside the box, so we can't go outside the box. But
exactly.
Now you hear people talk about mystical experiences, which in their lives seem to have causal efficacy, or unexplainable spiritual experiences. You know, hearing the voices of a grandmother, or experience of former lives. There's lots of strange things that you hear, and there are lots of different ways of explaining it. But does this kind of view of a potentially multiple dimensional universe allow these things to potentially be considered as maybe there are lots of dimensional aspects that we don't perceive and don't understand, except there may be these kind of one-off experiences that can't be explained?
Well, that's okay. Great question. So let me take it in a couple of stages. First, I'll refer back to William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And, I covered that book when I was actually doing some of my philosophy. I did take some philosophy of religion classes. If you try to apply a scientific view to those sort of examples raised over a century ago, there's lots of reasons to doubt that it was anything besides, biochemical, etc. And so I tend to take a scientific view of that it seems unlikely, again, because I tend to believe in a closed physical universe where I don't see anything interfering with that. But there's an enormous tradition of religion and meditation and religious people who have felt they have experienced something beyond what we tend to find in our four-dimensional experience of the universe. And is it possible there's a crack in the cosmic egg in some way, and that we can have some look outside of those four dimensions? Big question. Big question. How is our experience embedded in the four dimensions? Just sort of locked in because from the time that we were born, that's how we suddenly learned Humean experience, repeating over and over again that we have certain experience of the world, and that's how our consciousness becomes anchored in the four dimensions. Is there some way to, if there are more than four dimensions in our empirical universe, is there any way that we could experience that? Yeah, and I won't close the door to say there isn't.
Mm-hmm. One of the puzzles that comes to mind, or one of the risks that comes in mind, I know, is because I've seen people, it's easy to doubt and discount and deny. Mm-hmm. And you see that now with denialism in science, just simply not believing science because they can close it off. So if you conceive of the world in a certain way and you say, well, that's not possible, or you push that kind of a thing aside, then you won't see it. There's a great book, I can't remember the author's name, escapes me. It's called On Miracles. C.S. Lewis, On Miracles, where he talks about that thing that, you can see something one way, you can see something another way, the duck rabbit, kind of phenomenon. And, once you're seeing it in a certain way, you're going to see it in a certain way. You won't be able to see the other way if you're kind of confirmed in that. And, so we now have this model of potentially this kind of relational dimension that we don't really understand because we can't perceive it. But that opens the door to the possibility that, we got locked into the Newtonian worldview of four three dimensions of space and one of time, and excluded anything else. And so even if there is some evidence of that, it takes 100 years of quantum physics anomalies to start breaking open the mindset, right? So maybe we ought to be a little bit less dogmatic about the possibility that the ancient wisdom practices that humans followed for thousands and thousands of years. Well, maybe there's something there, and we
Well,
should be
yeah, and
open to that.
yeah, and what what is the I that is you, George? What I'll ask our listeners, what is the I that is you? What
Hmm.
is that really, really?
Hmm.
And so, what comes out of this relational view of the world is that all of these objects, all these things that we experience in four-dimensional space are relations, if they in fact exist in another dimension. And in fact, all of these systems are relations, they're
Hmm.
relational systems. And each of us is an enormously complex relational system.
Yeah.
And that's the essence of you. It's not this four-dimensional, this three-dimensional creature moving
Yeah.
through a
Yeah.
fourth dimension of
Yeah.
time. It's not. That's not really it.
Right.
So can we ever understand and really feel and experience our true self? Well, that's a good question. Are we locked into it and
Hmm.
we'll never see
Hmm.
it, or
So
not?
I came up with an example of this other dimensional thing. So my DNA is connected in a very, very sophisticated, complex network to the DNA of every human being on the face of the planet, right? Your
Hmm.
DNA, for example.
Hmm.
That's a relational network. It's real. It extends backwards into the past in a very complex kind of a way, and that's just as much of a statement about who I am. I mean, it's part of the trajectory of who I am or who you are, as the current space and time I happen to be in. So this is a different dimension, but it's also causal,
Hmm.
right?
Yes, yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
it's a causal network, a causal set of relationships that exists within space and time, but in a very complex way. And then you look at language is another one. It was a causal, has causal power, but where did the language come from? How did that develop? It's a whole set of relations and evolutions of that
Hmm.
particular set of relational characteristics over time. So I'm beginning to think, Gary, that maybe there's lots of dimensions to think about here.
Well, it just says that it's an incredibly elegant system of relations at so many levels, and it's actually quite beautiful universe that we exist in. So,
Yeah, yeah. Let me ask you one final question.
mhm.
Have you ever had any of those kind of experiences in your life where you just said, "Wow, I don't know, can't put a label on this. It's something that's transcendent or transports me."
Yeah. And I referred to William James to say that I'm very scientific, so sometimes one always wonders about those experiences. So there's I spent 30 years in tech, and there were a lot of small companies, a lot of startups that went sideways. So I like to describe my career as having a lot of at bats, lots of strikeouts, and along the way before I kind of had a very successful latter part of my career. And in those days when you're working 80-hour weeks and things are not going well, for a variety of reasons. I'm a very competitive guy, so you're working very hard, and I would also run to at the end of the day to stay in shape after all this work. And so I'd be out running 9 o'clock at night, and here in San Francisco. And there was one of those periods when it was yet again another company that was not going right, and and I was running up near the Golden Gate Bridge late at night, and I stopped and I looked out, and I had this transcendent feeling that I was looking at my house in the future. Okay, and that was such a bizarre thought because the places where I looking were something that was way out of my ability to afford it. But I had this feeling that was very hopeful that there was some future that was going to be much more positive than where I was. and it was a very powerful feeling of seeing something. That's where I'm at today.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's interesting. Part of your trajectory, Gary. This has been a delight. It's been a lot of fun. We covered a lot of ground. Got heavy into some big heavy issues, and going to digest that. We may have some opportunity on this podcast again down the road to work more on some of those. But I want to thank you very much for your time, and it's been a real delight. Thank you.
And thank you, George. It's been really great.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Making Sense of Complexity. Next episode, I will be joined by Michaela Emch, a multi-talented communication and marketing specialist, translator, safari guide, keen naturalist, and biology enthusiast. In 2021, Michaela wrote the book From Nature's Mouth, the handbook for bio-infused human communication. In the meantime, please explore the websites of our collaborators, Complexity Weekend, Planksip, and Talk of Today. And join the conversation on our social media outlets or at spiralinquiry.org. Stay well and have a great week.